Okay, let's get started here. So thank you all for doing this. This is a wonderful um, opportunity, I think, for us all to spend a little time, given the circumstances that is stolen choir from us in such a way, or other music making in such a way that we could get together and still improve our skills, even though we can't sing together in the same room. And by the way, that doesn't mean you can't sing at home and can't sing outside and whatever. It just means we can't all be in the same place at the same time singing, which I know is a big part of why we love this. But it is what it is. So we at Capella Nova wanted to offer these courses so that with an eye towards when we all get back together, we'll all be sort of more monster musicians and have a better grasp of what we're doing, so maybe we can focus even more of our energy on singing anyway. And so that's why we're offering the two courses this month on practical music theory, which is music theory meant to kind of give someone a crash course into reading music if they don't read yet, or to give everyone a sort of review of the basic fundamentals of music reading, music notation, and also understanding that how we approach the written note and the written score, so that when we get back to choir, you just kind of know what's going on a little better. So just to walk through the course a little bit as we get started, this week is focused on the idea of music literacy and giving us a framework to attach meaning to the idea of music literacy. I think everyone has their own sort of personalized idea of what they think music literacy is. Like, oh, well, I can read and I can read notes and I can do this, do that. Usually, we can't read as well as we think we do. And that is actually an exciting thing, because if you're in choir and you've been in choir and you're having a blast and you're doing just fine, there's even more to do, even more to plumb, so that you can be even better and get things even faster. So tonight is talking about literacy, how to develop fluency in this language of music that we deal in, and also a deep discussion of the difference between talent and skill. I cannot tell you how many times I've had people in my choirs who, because they cannot get past what has been drilled into them for many, many years about what is talent and what is skill, they cannot make progress because they can't give themselves the freedom to go after that. So we'll talk about that more tonight. The next week, we'll start at the hearing level. We'll get into more of how you develop fluency, but when children are learning a language as babies, as infants and toddlers, we're not asking them to read and write yet. We're asking them to hear and patter back to us. And so there are ways to do that in music, just the same as in any other language. It would be sort of silly to hand a 1-year-old a pencil and say, write your name, but we can get babies that age to say our name and say their name and communicate with us. So that's the idea of week 2. How can we learn the language of music so that we can hear it and speak it before we start writing it? Then week 3, we attack the written aspect of music, in particular, how pitch is notated. So pitch is being the highness or lowness of a note based on its frequency and how it's written on the staff. Week 4, as you can see here, is written music in terms of meter and time. So how we divide minutes and seconds and beats and half beats and all of that stuff, so that we can express on paper the music that we're hearing, the music that we know and we sing. And then this extra meeting at the very end is just so that we can all kind of see it all together at once. And if you're in the literature course, that sort of has a logical conclusion leading into the next month's course as well. But it's good to, after you take this all apart, to assemble it back together into one thing, so that you can have a look at what it looks like whenever I hand you a score in choir, and you have to, sort of read it all at once there. So that's the plan for this course. If you have any questions at any time during the week, during your study, please feel free to email me those or message me, however you prefer. Some of you are my friends on Facebook. You all can be friends on Facebook with me if you just add me. I'm JL Mazer on Facebook. Someone asked about maybe a Facebook group for the class. I think that's a great idea. So any of those ways is you can contact me and ask questions. I'll be happy to get back to you. In addition to the packet you downloaded from the website, each week I will send you a few more pages so that you can practice some of the skills we talk about, some of the things you learn about in this reading packet. It's good to practice drawing clefs, for instance, or drawing note heads and flags and things like that. Just as children, we're teaching them to read books. We also teach them to write little things about how was your weekend and whatever. You're never going to be asked to write anything too complicated, but it is a good idea to practice. So I'll be sending those out after our discussion because based on our discussion, I'll know what we all need. So that'll be coming to you tonight after our meeting. So let's start. So what I'd like to do, if you don't mind, is I'll read small sections of your reading packet. If you have your packet in front of you, feel free to reference it and make notes as needed. And then at logical stopping points on the way, we can stop and questions can be asked and things like that. A bit on protocol for these Zoom classes. The way I can tell if people are wanting to ask a question is by seeing who has unmuted themselves. So if you leave yourself muted while I sort of read for us and make comments on the material, and then only unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question or if you're getting ready to make a contribution of some kind. That way I can know to stop and address you and make sure that we all have our attention on what you're saying. Because if one of you has a question, you've heard this before a million times, I'm sure 10 of you have the question. So are there any questions right now? All righty, there being no questions, here we go. What is music literacy and how do we develop fluency? Music literacy is the reading, writing, and playing of music, as well as an understanding of cultural practice and historical and social contexts. Music literacy and music education are frequently talked about relationally and causatively. However, they are not interchangeable terms, as complete musical literacy also concerns an understanding of the diverse practices involved in teaching music pedagogy and its impact on literacy. Even then, there are those who argue against the relational and causal link between music education and literacy, instead advocating for the solely interactional relationship between social characteristics and musical styles. Musical communications, like verbal ones, must be put in the right context by receivers if their meanings are to come through unobscured, which is why the pedagogical influence of teaching an individual to become musically literate might be confused with overarching literacy itself. That's a mouthful, but what we're really getting at here is this idea that musical literacy involves the understanding of the written and read and performed music on the page, but also how we actually do the performance of that stuff. So while someone may have a very intimate knowledge of hymn singing, for instance, they still may not have any knowledge of 18th century part writing made famous by Bach, for instance, which is what all of our hymn music is based on. Homophonic, four-voice, SATB, chorale writing. And it's what we're saying is that you don't have to actually know about the procedures of that music in order to understand what makes a hymn, but it is still part of the idea of literacy. And by the same token, you can know exactly how Bach composed these chorales, but if you don't understand how we go about singing hymns in worship, then you still do not have a fluent understanding of what that music is. And hymn writing and hymn singing are not the end all be all of harmonic vocal part writing. So you have to know exactly what context the music exists in order to be literate and fluent in what that music is. Musical literacy is likewise not to be confused with music theory or musicology. These two components are aspects of music education that ultimately act as a means to an end of achieving such literacy. Even then, many scholars debate the relevancy of these educational elements to music literacy at all. The term musicality is again a distinct term that is separate from the concept of musical literacy as the way in which a musician expresses emotions through performance is not indicative of their music reading ability. So what we're getting at in this paragraph is your literacy in music cannot be confused with your understanding of the framework and the construction of that music or the history of that music. However, both of those factor into the effective performance of that music. A great example would be African American spirituals. There are plenty of people that sing spirituals with a deep understanding of the history and the gravitas behind that music, but they can do that whether or not they have an understanding of how those songs were actually written down or its place in music history, but our knowledge of the construction of the music itself on the page and also the historical context of that music both add to our overall sense of musical literacy. Given that musical literacy involves mechanical and descriptive processes, such as reading, writing, and playing, as well as a broader cultural understanding of both historical and contemporary practice, for example, listening, playing, and musical interpretation, while listening and or playing, education in these visual, reading and writing, auditory, and kinesthetic areas can work in tandem to achieve literacy as a whole. So, when we're teaching children to read and write in school, there's the idea of phonics, right? Teachers teach children to make, mimic, and create sounds that are the requisite parts of speech to clarify what they're saying, to make sure that they can speak clearly and identify if they have any issues in that area. At the same time, we're learning the alphabet. We're learning the small parts that make up the bigger words and the words that make up the sentences and the sentences that make up the paragraphs and the paragraphs that make up larger works of language, and learning how to construct these things from the smallest of units. You will remember when you're learning to read and write that your teacher probably read to your class and that they expected you to take turns reading to the class as well. And you played games in which things were repeated back and forth, call and response. All of these techniques to teach kids to read and write should be the same approach that we take in order to teach people how to make music. I think many of us arrive at music making having missed certain of those steps. And it's really to the point that sometimes, if you've been singing your whole life in church, for instance, you're going to be far and above those in the choir who perhaps haven't been singing in church their whole life, because it's that much less experience in music, even if what you do know about music is just coincidental at that point. But if you're learning music from the standpoint of not only what it sounds like and how to make those sounds, but how to read and write and how to interpret symbols and markings, and also how to internalize these things in your body. If you're not doing all of those things at the same time, the learning of music and music theory can be crippled and difficult. So let's stop here for just a second. And does anyone have any questions about this so far? What are your questions? No questions so far. Excellent. One of the major roadblocks I find to the amateur study of music, and when I say amateur, I mean by definition not professional. There are wonderful amateurs in this world who are performing at a professional level, but maybe don't have the training and don't have the experience a professional might. One roadblock to amateur progression through music literacy is this misunderstanding of what talent is and what skill is. So I'll read you what I've written here, then we can talk about it. Talent refers to the alleged natural ability to do something, while skill refers to the ability which is acquired by training and practicing. Talent is supposedly an inborn ability or natural aptitude of a person, which is often hidden and needs recognition. Skill, on the other hand, is a learned ability, and it can be developed in someone if they put their time and efforts into the study and development of it. Most people mistake love and desire in the arts as talent. Many students are identified young as people who love music, for example, and desire to do music and are labeled as talented. Ordinary, well-meaning people mistake the quick learning and fast early accomplishments of new musicians as an innate ability, instead of recognizing that the students' love of and desire for music motivated them to learn and therefore achieve those successes. This often leads to compounding mistakes by the students' parents and mentors as focus is placed on further accomplishments in order to validate their quote-unquote talent, instead of fostering their love and desire for music and feeding their hunger for more knowledge and varied experiences as they develop greater and greater skills. Talent, then, is not an innate ability, but a sincere love of the art at hand, and therefore the desire to practice and develop skill in the subject area. Anyone you encounter in your life who has impressive skills in whatever field or area, not just the arts or music, by the way, develop them from nothing at some point. Do not invalidate the lifelong work of a professional anything or a really good amateur of anything by attributing their well-earned skill to talent. And do not cripple the aficionado by continuing to claim that impressive skill is somehow a divine gift that they needed to be blessed with at birth in order to achieve. Side note, the word talent comes from talenta, plural of talentum, meaning a sum of money. Developing skills definitely requires a sum of money, and remember, time is money. So what I'm trying to express to you is that if someone has any ability whatsoever in anything, it's come from a lot of work. And so I love when I sit down and at the organ and I play something very impressive and someone comes up and says, "So you're so talented, you're so lucky." Well, thank you is the first thing I say. But what I think is, y'all should have been here for the hours and hours and hours it took me to work this piece out, note by note, measure by measure, line by line, so that I can perform a 2-minute flashy dashy thing at the end of a worship service. But everything is well earned, everything is well fought. And so choirs at the end of a season, when the music is challenging, you get to the end and you breathe a sigh of relief, like, oh my gosh, we made it. And if someone walked up to you and said, "Wow, that was amazing. You're lucky to be so talented. I wish that, I had that inside of me." And you can honestly say, "Well, no, we fought for every single note that we sang on that concert." And it's very true. It's often very, very true. Who has had any experience with this in their life? Who's been called talented at some point in their life and has experienced this sort of dumbing down of a skill into the idea of talent? I'm looking at Barbara shake her head. Barbara, tell us about your experience. Unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted?
There you go.
Okay. Well, it started in very early years when I was singing with the big bands and I was like 4 to 7 years old. And people would come up to mom and dad and say, where did she get that talent? And mom would say she works on it all day long. It's continued on through my life. It's worth it.
Absolutely. But see, when your parents said that, what they triggered in that other person was the next thing that person may have done or said was, we're so proud of how much you love music. That's amazing. Keep going, right? That's the kind of thing kids and adults and mature adults all need to hear. That's what I make my living saying every single day is, look, I recognize a love of this in you. Now, what you gonna do with it? You know what I mean?
You don't often get that kind of a reply.
Right. And as a person who, again, as a singer, my wife can attest to this, the awful noise that I made when I first started, loud noise, but awful unmusical noise that I made for years when I started. And then especially when I changed from baritone to tenor, I made some horrific noise. But every half step going up as I learned to sing was a trial and a fight. And when I learned to conduct, I didn't conduct very well at the beginning, and I had to unlearn a lot of bad habits. I mean, so every stage of my musical life has involved this kind of paradigm shift, and then this relearning and unlearning things all the time. And that's what every one of us go through all the time. And when you find yourself in new situations, have you ever met someone that had an undeniable love for what you were doing? And it doesn't have to be musical, y'all. It can, have you been in a sewing circle with someone who can't sew, and they want to sit at the machine and sew, make a quilt of day one? You know what I mean? Have you ever been around those people? They think that because they love it, they can, right? Just nod your head if you've known that kind of thing in your life. Loving something is the first step, but it's not enough, right? You can love Morton Lauridsen's music with all your heart. It is not going to make the Lux Eterna easier to sing. Matter of fact, that makes it harder because you're suddenly aware of the intricacies of that music, right? My grandmother used to make quilts, and she used to make these little yo-yos, and her sister would sit around hours and hours and days and days and days to lovingly make one of these yo-yo quilts. As much as I wanted to learn how to make yo-yos, she was like, you don't need to know how to make yo-yos, okay? Because this is hard and you're not going to want to do this. Have any of you experienced the lack of recognition of your love of something? Have you ever tried to tell your parents that you loved something? Mom, I really want to try that. Dad, I really want to try this, and it wasn't recognized in you? Probably what was happening was they hadn't seen any of those early accomplishments from you yet, right? I've talked about in the reading, people will mistake the early accomplishments of young musicians or new musicians as this, you were touched by Mozart on the way down from heaven, and so you know how to do it. And it's so wrong. It just means that someone sat at a piano a little longer and figured out where middle C was, and they have a little bit better grasp on things. That is another thing that gets in the way. I know plenty of people who, when I invite them to join the choir at church, for instance, they say, no way, I'm not musical and I can't sing, no. And then when you hear them laugh and when you hear them talk, you hear the music in there, you know what I mean? And they love it. But because they haven't had any of those early accomplishments, they don't feel like they're capable. Your capability is not predicated upon your early accomplishments. And in fact, you have to recognize that your first attempts at anything is going to be garbage. Naturally, is going to be horrific, okay? But you don't have to present everything to the public. So the first art pieces our children make in preschool, what are they? They're scribbles on paper, right? Scribbles, nothing. Mom and dad hang them on the fridge to teach the child how to have pride in themselves, but that doesn't mean we need to hang those in a gallery. But every child at an early age is very capable of making art and expressing themselves in pictures and coloring. Anyone who's worked with these kids sees the varied expressions of all these children, right? It's very sad to me when children are not encouraged because they're not virtuosos. Very few of us are virtuosos, and putting anyone under the putting anyone against the ruler of virtuosity is going to cripple their ability to continue. And it's one reason why our choirs aren't 500 people each. There should be 750 people in Voices Rising. There should be 550 people in Capella. There should be 1,000 people in the Civic. You know what I mean? Everyone should be in these choirs because everyone can. But our culture has done everyone a disservice by setting this ruler in a certain way that makes it really hard for people to experience the satisfaction and accomplishment of creating this art in a beautiful and personal way. And I see on all your faces an understanding of this truth, because I think you all are here because you love this in a certain way, and because at the very least you recognized in yourself a love of this art and craft. And that's the other aspect of this. Art is a beautiful personal expression of someone's expression, right? In choral music, for instance, we aren't expressing ourselves as much as we're expressing Schubert's idea about the Mass in his Mass in G, or Beethoven's idea of joy in his Ninth Symphony, or Mahler's idea of death in his Eighth Symphony, or his love for his wife in his Third Symphony. But it's more than just an expression. It's also a craft. How are you putting the requisite materials that construct this form of expression together in order to be expressive of it? Does everyone understand what I'm saying? The craft of this. So, we love the sound of a choir. I think everyone in here is, maybe you're not in my choir, but you're in a choir, or you've been around a choir. Everyone loves the sound of a choir in full flight, right? Can you make an ideal choral sound if you don't understand what makes a vowel, or makes a consonant? Or if you don't understand how the sound combines and forms the sound you want in the hall, even if it's not the sound you're making on the stage. These are really complicated things. It's why I have a job, right? It's why you all have somewhere to go, because it is kind of what we explore and what we do. It is important to always remember that everything has a craft element to it. And even if you don't know what that is, you can still actively participate in it. You all actively participate in major and minor triads when you sing together. That doesn't mean you necessarily know what a major and minor triad is, but you can know. And that right there, folks, is the key that I think we all miss in our education, in our continued adult education, is that you may not understand, but you could. It may take a minute for you to recognize the truth of what you're missing, or the truth of what you need to know, but you could know. And that's the point of these community musicianship courses, is to maybe give you just a glimpse of what you could possibly know. And when I'm sitting in my studio here at home with my score open and my pencils, I'm not approaching that score the same way I am when I have the baton in my hand in the rehearsal hall. No one's going to expect you to give us harmonic analyses and things in the middle of rehearsal, so you can all relax. But it is good to know, I'm an alto, and I have the third of that chord there on that fermata, so you can listen for it and you can know exactly where you're going. That will make you a stronger musician. Understanding that Schubert certainly meant something very important when he wrote a German augmented sixth chord, right before the grand pause in the middle of the Benedictus of the Mass in G. That being a really weird chord, okay, I'm looking for something interesting in Schubert's expression there, because no one just writes those chords for no reason. If all of that sounds like gibberish to you, I wish that I could be you right now. I talk to Hannah all the time about, I wish I could hear Wagner's Ring for the first time again. I wish that I could start again and kind of forget it and then go into it again, because it's exciting. If you think you love music now, this course will give you one drop of insight more, but just wait until you have an understanding enough to really understand what Schubert meant in the Mass in G, or what Bruckner meant in the Mass in E minor, or what Beethoven meant in the Ode to Joy. Seriously. It's an exciting, exciting thing. So if you feel overwhelmed, you are in the most exciting position of all, because you have the most to discover. It's kind of like you're standing in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and you haven't been in there yet. And I'm like, dude, you wait till you get into the lobby. You might not get out of the lobby today. It's a wonderful, amazing thing. So what I'm asking you to do is feel that excitement, feel that love of this art that you love dearly, and let that guide and let that motivate your further study, so that when you're in the middle of a page of drawing treble clefs or note identification, or the day that you all figure out that it's not just treble and bass clef, but it's also alto and soprano and baritone and tenor clef, and these movable C clefs can be anywhere. You know what I mean? It's when that happens and you get scared and you kind of get frustrated, remember that you're doing this because you love this, and you're doing this because you want to get better and you want to understand, and let that keep you going, because it's definitely, definitely, definitely worth it. Did I read to the end of this section for this week?
Yep.
I did. Okay, good. So there is no homework for this week, because we're going to be talking about hearing music and hearing the different elements of music. What are the elements of music? Melody, pitch, rhythm, timbre. So this week, your assignment is to, whenever you're listening to music or hear music in any setting, so even if it's during the commercials on television, try and see if you can hear where the beat is. And then if you can hear the notes over the beat, and maybe you can recognize instruments. You need to realize that if you can hear a recording and you can say, I hear a guitar, and I hear drums, and I hear a piano, and I hear a singer, you are a mile ahead of many people. Many people cannot differentiate the timbre of different instruments when they hear music. That's something we should practice and we should get good at. That leads very organically into the choral rehearsal hall, where you say, aha, I can hear sopranos, altos, tenors, and basses, and you can hear your colleagues across the choir no matter where they are. So work on that this week. Think about why you love music and what is motivating you to learn more about it. Understand that whatever that reason is your reason, and it's like your happy thought that's going to let you fly away in Peter Pan. So you don't need to justify it to anybody, certainly not to me. My reasons for loving music are probably not what you expect. And I don't need any of y'all's permission to feel what I feel about it. And you don't need mine, and you don't need anyone else's. And once you break those chains, you're going to be on your way. Does everyone feel empowered and happy? I certainly do. This is very exciting. I taught sight singing and ear training at the University of Florida for a few years. And this is the one thing that I thought the students missed most, was in Theory 1, students who all loved music enough to pay application fees, big application fees, and pay a lot of money to come study music at the University of Florida, hadn't figured out yet that it's okay for them to love this for their own reasons. And I saw a lot of kids burn out in that class. I didn't have the control or the authority to tell them what I've been able to tell you tonight, but I wish that this was the first day in any music theory class at any level. I think in my PhD seminars at University of Florida, I wish they had started with this. Not that they even believe this, but they should, because it's important. If you get into the weeds and forget this, you're going to stop learning, and you're going to forget why this is important to you, and that's never going to be productive. And so this is why I spent a whole session on this topic, because I think if you can hold this close, then you can learn anything. And I think if we forget this, then our learning stops. I'm sure you can, just thinking now, I can think of 10 examples in my life of people, not even in music, who this has happened to them. People who work in hospitals and forget that they love caring for people frequently will get burnt out when they start having to code things in a hospital, right? But one of my favorite people who work in a hospital, relate the idea of coding things as a nurse to care. And so they're the best, registrar person in a hospital, because they know why that's important and they can really go for it. So it's not just music, folks. It's not just anything. It's everything. This is how I live my life, is in this perpetual state of wonder, trying to figure things out. And I invite you to come with me, because it's the best place to be. You're never stuck if you're here. And you will lose the thread once in a while, but that's okay too. Any questions? Any thoughts? I want to hear some comments. Yes, Sandy? Could you unmute yourself, Sandy?
Okay, am I unmuted?
There you go, Sandy.
Okay, good. Okay, when we were talking about talent, what looks like obvious talent and development of that, there was a famous story about Benny Goodman that I always remembered. He was being interviewed, and they said to him, you really just had that music in your head all along, didn't you? And he said, oh, no, it doesn't work that way. He said, you have to have the calluses on your lips and the calluses on your fingers. He says, it doesn't work that way at all. So I just thought that was pretty neat. What he was saying was, no, you got to practice.
Spot on. What made Benny Goodman so famous too was the way he played that clarinet. And there's another quote by him where he said that the basis of his playing in that jazz idiom was scales and arpeggios.
Oh.
So, it starts you start with the fundamentals and you go from there. Excellent, Sandy. Thank you. Anyone else? Thoughts and experiences? I want to hear them. I collect these kind of things.
There's a book from the 90s that was maybe titled Be Like Mike or something like that was about Michael Jordan, where so many people take the assumption that he was just gifted and that was all it took. And the reality is he practiced in order to be the success that he was. Which
yes, absolutely
is true with what happens with musicians.
Mm-hmm. That book was actually heavily cited in the book called The Talent Code. And if you haven't read The Talent Code, this book hypothesizes that really the all that you need in order to be professional at anything is 10,000 hours of experience. And one thing that they sort of postulated was that Mozart wasn't a virtuoso at all. It's just that his father put him through hell for the first 4 years of his life, and he had 10,000 hours. So that's why at 6 years old, he could write these sonatas, and at 10, he could write symphonies and operas, because he had more experience at 8 years old than many of us have at 30 because of his father, for better or worse. You know what I mean? And I sort of like that. And on the other hand, I don't, because some people do have better traction. An hour of study for some of us is more productive than an hour of study for others. And what I don't want to do is talk to people who have 10,000 hours and who are still working and somehow insinuate at all that because they're at 10,000 hours and they're not at the Metropolitan Opera, that they somehow have failed. That makes me worry, because there are plenty of people who are 70 or 80 years old in my choirs who have 10,000 hours on me. You know what I mean? And so we don't want to devalue their experience either. But The Talent Code is a wonderful book. If you haven't read that book, it's like $4 on Amazon. You can grab that and read it and tell me what you think about it. There's more to it than that too, but it's a good book. Any other thoughts? Yes, Sylvie.
So there is no such thing as an innate talent. That's what I'm getting from what you said.
Well, I think there is an innate desire in some of us. For instance, there's this little girl who's the daughter of one of the administrative assistants at my church, when she walks up to one of my instruments in the choir room, the look on her face, you can tell that's what she loves. She wants to know about that. That is probably closer to the idea of talent than I would put on someone's ability to sit down at a piano and pick out a melody. You know, a kid can sit down at a piano and pick out a melody because they worked it out at some point. Some people have a sort of something that we perceive as innate attachment to certain forms of expression. You're going to have people who love to dance, people who love to sing, people who loved it. But you know, if my teacher had judged my ability to be a singer based on my first sounds when I walked in his studio this one day as a piano major, wondering about singing, I would not be a singer today. But he believed, as I believe, which is that if you want to sing bad enough, you're going to figure it out. And even if you're not a great singer, there's a repertoire for you. And that's kind of how I like to function. But kids, I see them every day. I mean, in my preschool chapel at the Lutheran church I work at, when I stand up there with the guitar and I sing songs, you can point out very clearly the kids that are looking at that guitar going, ooh, I want to see that. Come closer. I want to touch that. Those kids would end up being more quote unquote talented as they're assessed by others, just because they love it enough to sit down and, you know, play with the guitar until they can figure out how to strum the thing. But anyone can, you know, if any of us were challenged to do it and say, look, Barbara, if you learn how to play a G, a C, and a D chord on a guitar, I'll give you $1 million. You could figure it out. You know what I mean? Any of us could. So it's how much you want it. And, you know, when I hold choir auditions, quote unquote, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at them and I'm saying, how much do you want this? Because I will never, ever keep someone out of my choir if they want it. I don't care if they're brand new. And in fact, I had this guy back when I was with the Civic Chorus who did the summer choir, and he told me point blank, he's like, man, I love choir. I do not know how to sing. I don't know what this is you just handed to me. I just want to be here. And he sat in the middle of that choir with his eyes closed for an entire summer in utter bliss. And when he came out of that summer, the man could sing and the man could read. So he didn't even realize that he was learning, but he was, because he loved it. So I won't keep anyone out. This general attitude that I'm going at is what I want to teach you tonight is so critical for your success and continued success, and also for anyone's success. So if the 16 of you leave this course tonight and can encourage someone the right way this week, then we've won. I mean, just hands down, we can end the course now. We've made it. But I want you to remember this when you start getting frustrated during the study of music theory and music literacy this month. Any other questions or comments? Persistence is the key. I'm reading in a private message. Persistence. Nothing in this world can take the place of persistence. A quote by Calvin Coolidge. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent, people with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. Calvin Coolidge. Amen. That's it in a nutshell.
Josh?
Yes, ma'am.
How much of it, when you're talking about the preschoolers, those that are drawn to music, how much of that is because of their exposure to music?
Probably has a ton to do with it.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking that if a child is exposed to music, then they may be more likely to like music and then be more gravitated to being a musician or just enjoying music.
Certainly. I am a musician today because of my elementary school music teacher. At the end of every one of these little music classes we'd have once a week, she put on the slow movement to the New World Symphony with the English horn solo, and she'd turn off the lights and start playing that piece. And I remember what are these chords and what is that sound? And she would walk around the classroom with this little turtle puppet. And if you pet the turtle nicely, she'd give you a red hot. And it just like imbued this experience of this music with a sense of love. But there were people sitting right next to me who did not like music and did not become musicians. So I think it's sort of important that we expose kids to a little bit of everything so they can figure out what they have an affinity for. But you know, there's also kids, there's preschool chapels that are very disinterested by what I'm doing and are not going to sing along. And that's okay too. That's okay too. All right, everybody. Well, I am so thankful to behold your faces for 50 minutes tonight, even if it's over Zoom. Do read ahead, please, and take some notes, have some questions ready so that next week we can spend this time, precious time we have with each other, asking questions and sort of inquiring and putting these things together. Particularly after a week of listening to music a certain way, I do want to hear your thoughts on how you experience music and how you perceive these different elements of music. So be ready to talk about that if you desire. And I'd love to hear from everybody. I sort of collect all of these things so that I can have ways of explaining it to others who maybe can't find their own way. So do be ready. I'll be thankful for that. Thank you all so very much. People who are also in the Choral Lit class, I'm going to end this meeting. Go find my email about Choral Lit and use that link to join the Choral Lit Zoom. Next week, we'll use the same link. But this week, I didn't think it through. Thank you all so very much. Have a wonderful week of music making. Keep singing. I'll see y'all later.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.